Chapter 12, The Rise of the Modern Age. Part 1, Rationalism Replaces the Christian Worldview. Section 1, Understanding the Spirit of the Times. Thus far, we've been looking at the progressivist era largely in terms of its material quality, presented in terms of the vast material wealth that a number of Americans enjoyed, or the lack of that same material wealth suffered by others, and the politics involved in trying to make such materialism work to the greater advantage of individuals, groups of individuals, and even the nation as a whole. We have looked at individuals whose energy made much of this possible, the captains of industry and finance, or robber barons, if you were distressed at how poorly this rising wealth was distributed more broadly among the American population, and the inventors and technical innovators, whose ideas kept the progressivist era moving ever forward to a new and truly amazing material inventions and developments. The act of progress and the revolution of rising expectations. But at this point, we want to look more closely at the spirit of the times, the intellectual, moral, and spiritual character of American culture, and the forces that shaped it. Because the very idea of wealth, or of poverty, is not itself an objective matter like an automobile, a large or small house, the clothes someone wears, or humble or exotic nature of what is found on the dinner table, etc. Indeed, the very poor were actually better off materially than the middle classes of just a couple of centuries earlier, when the planet was less able to support a large human population. People, of course, still suffered from fatigue, hunger, disease, and just plain aging. But the profile of Westerners at the turn of the century demonstrated actually a vitality among vast numbers that would have been unthinkable just generations earlier. Yet poverty was there, bitter poverty for some, especially for those, mostly in America's fast-rising cities and industrial towns, whose lives contrasted so sharply to the lives of the very, very wealthy, who benefited awesomely from the labors of those poor souls. Yet the poor souls were actually doing much better materially than their medieval counterparts. But expectations were there nonetheless that justice was not being well served by the way America's vast wealth was being distributed. Certainly that idea formed much of the drive behind the progressivist movement. If the gap between rich and poor, as it had always been through the ages, had remained largely unchanged, little would have been said about the matter. It would have been accepted as the normal scheme of things, as it had been for centuries. But things were changing rapidly, and with them the expectations of the benefits, the fruits of change. And those expectations, emotional and intellectual, were the reality that people actually responded to. And they were rising as fast or faster than the actual material growth of the American economy and technology. With time, the simplest of Americans would be drawn into the world of the new gadgets and lifestyle possibilities, because such fast-developing wealth needed the American people themselves, what ultimately we would identify as the consumer, to absorb the end products of the economic system. Henry Ford understood this principle very well and got very rich from it. But America's reality at the turn of the century was not really in just interesting material statistics, but in the fact that America was going through a revolution of rising expectations. And those expectations were the reality that Americans responded to. So at this point, we turn to the all-important question. What exactly were those expectations? What was it exactly that Americans were thinking concerning their situations, their lives? The mechanics of social thinking. People themselves are actually not very innovative thinkers, but borrow thought from larger society. Individuals have personalities of their own, of course, But even more importantly, they developed social personalities, a sense of personhood drawn from the cultural themes around them, themes that others generate for them individually, opinion leaders, and collectively, out of a commonly perceived social experience they find themselves in. In other words, people mostly follow the crowd of one kind or another, and what they do, how they act, how they react, is shaped not so much by their own personal reasoning as much as by the reasoning of the social group they identify themselves with, or actually groups, some cooperating to give them even more strength to the social idea, or on the other hand, clashing, causing much personal confusion and frustration. So again, what were Americans thinking at this time? How were they redesigning their personal universe? Something big was going on because all of this material change was stirring new cultural ideas that challenged Americans to rethink their world. Europe's lead in the emerging post-Christian culture. One more point. America itself was not doing this in isolation, but was itself participating, most willingly, in a larger rethink of all of Western civilization. This civilization used to be called Christian civilization. But although people still use that language in describing a desirable Christian world, a larger Christian moral code, a set of Christian social goals, the reality was that Christianity was not any single social political idea, as the violent Protestant Catholic wars of religion of the early to mid-1600s clearly demonstrated. In any case, new ideas were on the rise within this Christian West that had no connection with the idea of the sovereign rule of God or the saving power of Jesus' lordship over the world. Something else in the West was fast replacing Christian culture, a new culture identified by various labels: materialism, empiricism, Darwinism, secularism, humanism, socialism, etc., all of which developed from this rising sense of man's own powers to conquer and reshape the world by his own designs, his own logic, and his own powers, his own ability to see his human programs put into place to make this world a much, much better place. All of this material energy was thus serving in different ways to give Western civilization a new and very aggressive personality. It was all very heady stuff. Just in looking around at all the material bounty that came with this new think, it is not surprising how very compelling this new culture was. Christianity, with its call for humility in approaching life, and its emphasis in trusting God alone to get things right, just was not the formula for achieving this world of material bounty. And thus people's minds and hearts were fast shifting to this exciting new world. In this development, Europe was way ahead of America, but America was learning quickly. America had its own new ideas about life. But, by and large, Americans found themselves greatly attracted to the high level of social thought coming from Europe. In fact, it was considered the height of sophistication to be able to go off to Europe to study. Now, the reverse was hardly the case yet. Indeed, in the realm of higher thought, America mostly simply found itself responding to European developments that were well underway across the Atlantic. And that would even take America right into the Great War, that is, World War I, 1914 to 1918, which America long debated before making the fateful decision to jump into the event. And thus, for much of this section, we want to look at Europe and the thought processes going on there, and how that shaped global events, one that formerly isolationist America avoided during its fragile early development. Now America found itself unable to resist the European dynamic, but instead joined in. unfortunately in full measure. Part 2. The Rising Age of Western Rationalism. The very ancient roots of the central problem arising with the adulation, even worship, of human reason. The use of human reason rather than reliance on divine guidance is not a new issue on this planet. It certainly did not arrive for the first time with Europe's step into the modern age, considered by historians to have started somewhere around the mid-1600s. The very ancient Judeo-Christian Bible begins its narration with this very issue, immediately after the story of divine creation. The narration centers on man's first temptation, to go his own way rather than to go with God. That is the essence of the story of the Garden of Eden, in which God had forbidden Adam and Eve to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He did not explain why, because they were still obedient to God rather than deciding themselves what was good and what was evil. However, the tempter, in the form of a serpent, soon intervened in the story to put the thought in the minds of this primal couple that knowing on their own what was good and what was evil would make them like God. That was, and still is, quite a temptation, one they could not or would not resist. And so they ate of the forbidden fruit, and troubles began immediately. Western civilization continues to wrestle with this same issue. It's a great parable, absolutely ageless in its wisdom, as Europe was already discovering. And if they had not learned about the truth of the parable in observing the events of the wars of religion, the early to mid-1600s, or the French Revolution at the end of the 1700s, they were about to have the same issue put squarely in front of them again in the form of the Great War, which, unknown to them, was about to break out in seemingly unprecedented fury. But that part of the story belongs to our next chapter. But in any case, let's at this point take our story of Western civilization's effort to make sense of this newly emerging world all the way back to Europe during the times of the European Enlightenment in the 1600s and 1700s. Looking at the birth of these modern trends of social thought and action will help us not only to understand how we got this way, but also the difficulties we will have if we do not learn from the past. We've already discussed Locke and Rousseau in some detail, but they were children of the European Enlightenment, not its founders. Descartes, early to mid-1600s, challenges Christian truth with a new reliance on pure reason. That honor as founder of the European Enlightenment probably goes to René Descartes, who in the early 1600s wrestled with the epistemological problem of understanding how we can be certain that what we claim to be true is indeed true. Because there is such a huge gap that separates our mind from what we believe we see out there. How do we actually know what is true or not? This was not just some philosopher's idle question. Descartes was living at a time in which the wars between Catholics and Protestants and between rising monarchs in different parts of Europe were constant and having a deadly effect on European society. Each of the contenders justified their bloody violence on the basis of one or another truth claim. So Descartes took up the challenge of trying to lay out a basis by which the contenders could pursue these truth claims logically, rather than violently, presuming that these contenders were indeed all that interested in truth rather than just domination. Descartes observed that the world around us operated purely mechanically or mathematically, and that if we disciplined our minds to work in the same way, that is, rationally or mathematically, we could actually close that gap between our minds and the surrounding world. There was no need for inspiration, no need to rely on tradition or the conventional teachings of society. Man was fully capable of arriving at all truths, even able to prove the existence of God, simply through the exercise of precise human reason. With that Cartesian challenge, the age of reason was off and running. Newton, Leibniz, Locke. Three individuals stand out in particular in the follow-up, the later 1600s, to Descartes' birth of the age of reason. The two Englishmen, Isaac Newton and John Locke, and the German Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz and Newton were both brilliant mathematicians. Both seem to have discovered calculus at about the same time, that is, around 1670. Leibniz tended to follow more closely the lead of Descartes and other rationalists on the European continent in believing that pure reason, built simply on logical principles arrived at through clear thought, could design a perfect world, and was optimistic that such was soon possible. Newton tended more to the empirical side, typical of the British, believing that nothing could be considered true until it had been observed to actually work in the real world. But he was also something of a Christian mystic, which in general the continental school of rationalism rejected completely. We have already met Locke, a friend of Newton's, who too believed in the power of human reason to solve life's various problems, whatever they might be. But Locke, like Newton, was also a highly empirical philosopher who stressed the importance of putting our ideas to the test, of observing their success or failure in the actual world of people and things. We also know that Locke was very much a social philosopher, but he was also a student of human psychology, able to put the two worlds of the individual and society together in a rational order. His understanding was that human thought is importantly a collective matter, shaped by the thinking of the larger social world and the particular experiences that social world was facing and how that society interpreted those experiences. But again, his belief was that this social world must be, improved through the careful thinking through of life's processes in order to bring life closer to perfection. Locke and his writings would go on to influence deeply the philosophy of most of the social philosophers of the 1700s, including, as we have seen, Thomas Jefferson. Rousseau and early Romanticism. Of a very special or distinct philosophical contribution to the discussions of 1700s France was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We've already mentioned his place in and impact on the thinking of the Age of Enlightenment, that is, the 1700s. He was French-cultured Swiss, whose writings, especially The Social Contract, 1762, were very popular in France. He raised the question of political sovereignty, where it was lodged, and how it functioned to best serve the people. Rousseau claimed that originally man lived in some kind of simple natural state of harmony without laws or government. But life had evolved over time into a more complex form, civilization, requiring as it developed greater mutual dependence among men for the orderly working of society, and thus also a more complex system of moral instruction or law to guide this more complex society. Man accordingly had to give up his total personal sovereignty to come under the protection and nurture of more complex society. but he was giving it up not to some ruling individual, but to the larger idea of the society as a whole, the general will, in particular its laws, which were the clearest expression of a people's general will. The laws, not any particular individuals, were the locus of sovereignty in a truly good society. Unfortunately, ignorance of this good had clouded people's political understanding, allowing them to slip into all forms of political tyranny, absolute rule over society by particular individuals, such as kings and dukes, which was the general pattern of his day. Rousseau's hope was to open men's eyes to the understanding of what was truly right and good about society, that such knowledge would free men to usher in a good or utopian society that was truly the right of everyone to enjoy, not just the privileged few. All the superfluous fluff of a decadent civilization, in particular French civilization as it was viewed in his own time, would be simply swept away by the opening of the eyes of the people to the truth. With the Ancien Régime, the old order, comprised of the officers of the king and church that dominated all European society in the 1700s, with the old order thus swept away, society would be free to create or contract a social system as simple and basic as possible. A social system directed by a set of basic laws that restored to man his fundamental liberties, allowing him to live as close to the original state of nature as possible. The French were strongly impacted by Rousseau's theories, as have been many revolutionary secular philosophers since Rousseau, as well as modern hippies, trying to go back to nature and simple communal living. Rousseau's vision of primitive society even found its way into polite social gatherings or salons of Europe's ruling classes and their intellectual tutors. Thus it was that the future Queen, Marie Antoinette, as a young princess, used to love to play in the Versailles palace gardens with fellow maidens of the French court, at being a peasant girl herding her sheep. It was all so quaint, so romantic. The French monarchy was sick, very sick. Reforms were needed. But by Rousseau's logic, that reform was going to have to be extensive for the good society to result. The old order was going to have to be set aside in its entirety in order to make way for the new. Thus, with Rousseau's encouragement, the French political mood was becoming increasingly revolutionary as the political debate in the late 1700s intensified in France. The reaction to such rationalism, British empiricism. We have already seen how in the 1700s the Enlightenment was answered in the American colonies and in England by the mysteries of the Great Awakening, led by such figures as Edwards and Whitefield, and the broad popular response of the common people to that dynamic. While continental Europe in general was bypassed in that event, nonetheless, as the 1700s moved along, something of a strong reaction to rationalism set in among some of the European philosophers and scholars, something that had very little to do with going back to Christian basics. But that non-Christian reaction to continental rationalism would take very different forms, tending to empiricism in Britain and romanticism in continental Europe, though varieties of both could be found in both locations. To begin with, the British were of a more practical mindset in their love of hands-on experimentation than their continental cousins, who loved to sit at their desks or gather at polite salons to indulge themselves in the world of pure thought. During the Enlightenment, the British were too busy inventing new material technologies and developing the industries to put these technologies to practical use, to be wasting time speculating about hypothetical realities. They were, by all nature, empiricists. David Hume promotes empiricism. In the mid-1700s, the Scottish philosopher Hume had his own answer to the rationalism that infected so much of European society. As a philosophical empiricist, the widely read and respected Hume found sufficient truth for life in simply observing actual behavior and the results it produced. Results were to Hume real truth. Long-abiding custom, in other words, social rules that actually worked over the long run, were for Hume the foundations on which to build human life. Hume, on the other hand, was most unimpressed by the great intellectual spins that philosophers wove around hypothetical behavior and building their great systems of thought. For Hume, reality was in the doing, not in the hypothesizing about life. Widely studied, Hume became well known in his time for his skepticism about speculations about God or great systems of religious truth or the validity of objective ethical systems, even the claims of science to have established an explanation of all life in terms of cause and effect. All this was to Hume mere intellectual humbuggery. Hume's impact lived long after him. In fact, it was Hume that awoke the great German philosopher Kant from his intellectual slumber, as Kant himself put it, and caused Kant to undertake the task of responding to the challenge that Hume had issued to those who would claim to understand human nature, even life itself. Adam Smith explains capitalism. In the meantime, the British were very busy inventing new material technologies and developing the industries to put these technologies to practical use. Building on this attitude was the fellow Scot, Adam Smith, who in his Wealth of Nations wrote a compelling explanation of how simply letting the competitive marketplace bring forward the material blessings of life and the pricing involved for such wealth would naturally bring forth human progress. He was opposed to the idea of forcing on society the designs of utopian social planners who would soon enough make a mess of things with their well-reasoned schemes. In fact, Smith was strongly opposed to any kind of intervention into this market mechanism by the government or any other outside societal institution. To Smith and all capitalist philosophers since then, this was the key doctrine of capitalist philosophy. But at the same time, Smith was highly opposed to market insiders getting together to conspire to set prices through a withholding of goods and services to create an artificial scarcity. He was thus opposed to cartels, monopolies, and unions of any variety. He also considered the danger of rapid population growth distorting the labor market and driving prices down to subsistence levels. But he felt that economic growth of the whole industrial sector would constantly increase the demand for labor and thus prevent such cruelties from occurring. Kant attempts a compromise between British empiricism and French rationalism. Immanuel Kant was something of a father to German philosophy, setting out just prior to the French Revolution to locate some kind of intellectual bridge between the powerful philosophies of French rationalism and British empiricism. Kant agreed with Hume's empiricism, namely that essential to human knowledge is our sense experience, the experience of the seeing, feeling, hearing, etc., of real material objects around us. But he also agreed with the continental rationalists, most notably Leibniz, whose writings were also a major influence over Kant, that knowledge is also a matter of the exercise of human reason, in particular, the use of innate human ideas, something like Aristotle's categories, which we are born with, and which help us to organize this empirical information. Thus, Kant saw himself as closing the intellectual gap between the British empiricists and the continental rationalists. Kant also saw himself answering Hume's skepticism about ever knowing with any degree of certainty the truth of transcendent ideas, such as moral laws or ethical principles. In Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, 1785, and Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, he proposed a new moral ethical categorical imperative, one that did not require the existence of God for its validity. It involved an ingenious piece of moral logic. We ought to act in such a way that our act could become accepted as a universal principle of behavior. If it were not able to attain such universal validity, because, for instance, of an internal contradiction in logic, then that action, by practical reason, was obviously not to be pursued. Taking this logic of practical reason a step further, he turned to the issue of the existence of God. He agreed with Hume that no rational argument could be given for God's existence, that is, pure reason could not build a case for God's existence, but practical reason could. Pursuing a traditional line of reason that went back at least as far as Occam in the early 1300s, Kant claimed that human reason cannot establish the fact of God, but in observing the moral instincts of people, we can see, through the eyes of faith, that there is some kind of source beyond the mere human will itself that directs life. That higher moral grounding is, by definition, God. Thus, God exists. This kind of theological reasoning did not impress the Prussian government, which censured his work. Finally, so impressed was Kant that we humans could live in accordance with such higher moral imperatives that in his Perpetual Peace, he laid out a vision for a new world order. Here begins the utopian idealism that will absorb the thoughts and aspirations of intellectuals for generations to come. But he was presenting his ideas over 10 years before the French Revolution. The French Revolution plunges ahead, seeking a rational utopia. Of course, rationalism was by no means dethroned by Rousseau's romantic reaction or the challenge of British empiricism, because it was pure rationalism that drove French intellectuals and Paris mobs to their violent behavior during the French Revolution, a revolution that soon produced horrors on the scale of the religious wars of the 1600s that had first inspired rationalism. During the bloody revolution that broke out in 1789, absolute reason brought forward powerful people who became absolute in their authority, and thus highly susceptible to very sophisticated self-deception, as they murdered people by the thousands in the name of reason. What these rationalists failed to see was how easily reason, in the face of the serious challenge of ruling a very diverse people, could be so easily twisted to serve merely their own narrower self-interests, rather than the dreamy goal of serving all the people according to some kind of higher interest they claimed they were pursuing. What these utopian rationalists had naively come up against was the complex issue called reality, something of which in their lofty world of aristocratic salons they knew virtually nothing. Reactions to the French Revolution. With the exception of Jefferson, who, while living in France just prior to the 1789 Revolution, fell entirely in love with French rationalism, Americans in general took the same attitude as the Irish Edmund Burke, who expressed eloquently the horror that all of Britain felt about the very bloody results of the noble effort of the French people trying to be entirely rational. Burke pointed out, like Hume, that long-established traditions served the people well and should be reformed as necessary, not overthrown. Like the French, the Americans at the time were birthing a new republic, but unlike the French, the American Republic was built cautiously and on a very limited or restricted basis on political traditions and practices already well established in the colonies over the previous century and a half. Americans were not setting up a new government built on untested new principles dreamed up by social planners, like the French were attempting, and the results consequently were quite different from America to France. The Napoleonic Challenge. Eventually, around 1799, France was rescued by the military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte from the murderous folly of the French Revolution's reign of terror, 1792 to 1795, and the political chaos that followed it. Napoleon retained technical features of the revolution and even improved on them. For instance, supporting the metric system and rationalizing regional government through a new bureaucratic system which replaced the chaotic array of multitudes of local feudal domains, each with their own laws and standards and social interests. Pierre-Simon de Laplace gives rationalism a new lease on life. Laplace's further refining of Newton's theories. Newton had early outlined the gravitational theories designed to demonstrate that the planets moved about the sun in accordance to immutable mathematical principles. There were, however, still unexplained small variations in Newton's computations. He had not taken into account the gravitational attraction also working among the planets themselves. These small variations had the ability to destabilize Newton's mechanistic model of the solar system. But Newton was enough of a mystic to look to God to regulate the small variations so as to keep the whole system in order. Life is entirely mechanical. This idea of a small residual divine intervention was not a satisfying concept to Laplace. He understood the universe to be totally operative under the impersonal laws of nature. So, in 1773, he set out to give full mathematical explanation to the motions of the heavens in such a way that there would be no more need to call in God as the residual part of the equation. Thus, he successfully completed years later, through an unprecedentedly in-depth mathematical calculation of the eccentricities in the planetary orbits, taking into account their gravitational attraction to each other as well as the sun as they move through their respective orbits. This work was eventually compiled into the 5-volume study, Celestial Mechanics, 1799 to 1825. Ultimately, it earned him a place in the prestigious French Academy of Sciences. It also removed the idea of God further, if not completely, from the mechanistic cosmology that had been unfolding over the previous century. Not even deism could stand up to this assault. Laplace to Napoleon. No need of the God hypothesis. Indeed, the story goes that when Laplace presented a copy of his work to Napoleon, the latter uttered a concern that Laplace had made no mention in his work of the divine originator of this marvelous system, to which Laplace replied, "I have no need for that hypothesis."